My name is Claire Bennett. I am 32 years old, and if you asked me a year ago, I would have sworn there was nothing I wouldn't do for my sister. I paid off her credit cards when she cried over the phone. I covered her mistakes when she was too ashamed to tell our parents, and I sat with her through nights when she swore she couldn't take it anymore. I thought that kind of loyalty was unshakable. But all it took was one text, 12 cold words to cut me out of her wedding in the Maldives, as if I never mattered. Standing there with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, I realized family can break you in ways no stranger ever could. And when I finally stopped swallowing the silence, the secret I carried was enough to crack everything wide open. Let me take you back to where it began. I was standing in my kitchen in Seattle, still wearing my robe, cradling the first cup of lukewarm coffee, when my phone buzzed. The message popped up on the screen so short, it almost looked accidental. Guest list is finalized. This is my moment only. Hope you understand. Love you. I read it once, then again, 5, 6 times, as if another line would suddenly appear clarifying that it was all a joke. But that was it. No name, no greeting, no punctuation. Just Rachel's words stripped bare, slicing me out of her wedding like I was a stranger who barely mattered. I leaned against the counter, the ceramic mug heavy in my hand. My sister. My only sister. The same girl I had driven to urgent care at midnight when she panicked about her asthma. The same girl I had covered for when she maxed out her credit card and sobbed to me over the phone until I wired the money. And now she had erased me with 12 cold words. My stomach twisted, but no tears came. Not yet. Just a deep burn that made my chest feel hollow. My thumb hovered over her name, then pulled back. Calling her would only end in circles. She would say it was budget. She would say it was complicated. And I would be expected to swallow it like medicine, bitter but necessary. Instead, I tapped my mother's contact. She answered on the second ring, her voice falsely bright, as if she were already bracing herself. Hey, sweetheart. Everything okay? I didn't waste time. Mom, Rachel just sent me a message. She says the guest list is finalized and I'm not on it. There was silence just long enough for me to know she had already known. Then came the sigh, the soft cooing tone she used when she wanted me to stop pushing. Oh, honey, it's just a wedding. Don't turn this into a whole thing. My voice was flatter than I expected. Mom, I am her sister. How am I not invited to my own sister's wedding? I could almost hear her cluck her tongue the way she used to when I spilled juice on the carpet. It's not personal. They had to keep it small. I forced a laugh, sharp and brittle. She's inviting 150 people. I saw her post. Childhood friends, her yoga instructor, even her old piano tutor. Everyone but me. The silence stretched again, then she laughed lightly as if that would soothe me. You know how weddings are. Expensive, stressful. Maybe they thought you wouldn't mind sitting this one out. Wouldn't mind. The words landed like stones. I bit down on the anger rising in my throat. Mom, I've been there for her every time. When she moved across the country, when she couldn't pay her bills, when Trevor ghosted her, and she couldn't get out of bed. But now, for her biggest day, I'm not even worth a chair. Her sigh grew louder. Stop being dramatic, Claire. It's just one day. I ended the call without goodbye. The silence in the kitchen was deafening, broken only by the tick of the wall clock like it was mocking me. I set my mug down, too hard coffee sloshing over the rim, and walked into the living room where Michael was hunched over his laptop, glasses sliding down his nose. He looked up immediately, his brow furrowing. You okay? I sat down beside him and handed him the phone without a word. He read the message, his jaw tightening. So you're not invited, nope. He exhaled slowly, set the phone on the table, and stood. Without saying anything, he went to the bar cart and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass. I frowned. It's 9 in the morning. He handed it to me anyway, if there was ever a morning for it. I took a sip. It burned, but it steadied me. She invited everyone else, I muttered. Friends from college, her boss, even one of Trevor's groomsmen who once tried to kiss me at a barbecue. But me, her own sister, no room. Michael sat back down beside me and rested his hand over mine. His voice was calm but certain. They don't get to decide your worth. If they don't want you there, then maybe we go somewhere else. I shook my head. Where would that even be? He tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. How do you feel about white sand, turquoise water, and zero family politics? My eyebrows shot up. Maldives, he nodded. We've been talking about going for years. Why not now? Let them have their spectacle. We'll have something better. I stared out the rain-streaked window, the gray Seattle sky pressing down heavy and familiar. For once, leaving didn't feel like running away. It felt like choosing myself. The clock ticked on the air, shifting just slightly. Something inside me had moved, something that had been waiting too long to be noticed. I turned back to Michael, his eyes steady on me. Book it, I said, and meant it. Michael closed his laptop and leaned back, studying me like he was weighing whether to push or stay quiet. I curled into the corner of the couch, the glass of whiskey still in my hand, though I barely tasted it anymore. He finally broke the silence, his voice careful but firm. Claire, you can't keep letting them decide your place. If your sister doesn't want you there, then maybe we take the hint and leave it behind. I pressed my palms to my temples. Leave it behind, she is my sister. How do I just walk away? Michael shook his head. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's killing you to keep chasing their approval. I stared at him, searching for something to hold on to. My chest felt tight, like there wasn't enough air in the room. It was easier when I was younger. Back then I believed if I worked hard enough, if I gave enough, if I kept forgiving one day, it would all balance out. But it never did. Michael reached for my hand, warm and steady. What are you really afraid of? That if I don't show up, I'll finally be the villain they already think I am? That I'll be erased completely? He was quiet for a moment, then said softly, maybe being erased from their story is the first step to writing your own. I swallowed hard, my throat burning more than the whiskey. His words sank into me, uncomfortable and true. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to answer a few work emails, half-heartedly skimmed reports from the marketing firm I managed, but my focus slipped again and again. Every thought circled back to Rachel's text, those clipped words, as if I had never been more than an extra in her life. When evening came, I called Melissa. We had lived together our sophomore year at Northwestern, and though we only talked every few weeks now, she was still the one person who never needed the whole backstory to understand me. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and full of the kind of familiarity I had been craving all day. Claire, what's wrong? I told her everything. The message, my mother's response, the way Rachel had painted me out of her life like I was a smudge on glass. There was a pause, then a low whistle. She really said it's her moment, only word for word. Melissa's voice sharpened. Then she deserves to stand in that spotlight alone. I laughed short and bitter. You make it sound so simple. It is simple. You've bent over backward for her your whole life. Remember when she had that internship in New York and called you crying because her portfolio got ruined in the rain? You overnighted her. A new one, spent half the night reprinting and binding her samples. You saved her, and she never once said thank you. I pinched the bridge of my nose, memories surfacing faster than I wanted. That summer, I skipped a friend's wedding to fly across the country and help Rachel move apartments. I carried boxes until my arms ached, paid the deposit because she had drained her checking account, then flew home broke and exhausted. And when she finally posted about her new place, she tagged Mom and Dad, but not me. Melissa didn't soften. And now she cuts you out of her wedding with a 2-line text. Claire, if this were happening to me, what would you say? I closed my eyes. I would tell you to walk away. Exactly. So why can't you tell yourself the same thing? Because it's me, I whispered. Because somewhere deep down, I still think maybe this time will be different. Melissa sighed, gentler now. You know what you deserve. You deserve peace. And peace won't come from begging for a seat at a table they never built for you. Her words lingered long after the call ended. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, my chest heavy with the weight of years I couldn't get back. Michael came in quietly, holding 2 mugs of tea. He set one on my nightstand, then sat beside me. Did talking to Melissa help a little? Enough to know I'm not crazy. He touched my cheek, turning my face toward him. You're not crazy, you're just tired of being invisible. I leaned into his hand, closing my eyes. He was right. The exhaustion wasn't just from this week or this wedding. It was years of being expected to fade into the background, years of watching Rachel take center stage, while I was told to be the strong one, the responsible one, the quiet one. When I finally crawled under the covers, sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept replaying Rachel's text, the dismissive tone in Mom's voice, the way Dad had stayed silent when I called. It was like a loop I couldn't turn off. Somewhere in the small hours of the night, though, another memory surfaced. It was 2019, the day Rachel landed her first brand deal. She had been panicking, her hair a mess, tears streaking her face because she thought she'd bombed the pitch. I had stayed up until 2 a.m. editing her presentation slides, coaching her through every answer. She signed the contract the next day, smiling like she had done it all herself. She never mentioned my name. That was the pattern. My work, my sacrifices, my time. Her spotlight. I opened my eyes to the dark ceiling and knew with a certainty that shook me. This time I would not let her erase me quietly. If Rachel wanted to keep her wedding spotless, she should have thought about the mess she left in my hands all these years. The clock on the nightstand glowed 3:30. Michael shifted beside me, half awake, reaching for me instinctively. I let him hold me, but my mind was already racing ahead. For once I wasn't thinking about how to clean up her chaos. I was thinking about what would happen if I finally stopped. The first light of morning crept through the blinds before I finally drifted off my decision, heavy but solid in my chest. Something had shifted. This wasn't about an invitation anymore. It was about who I was willing to be. By the time morning fully broke through the blinds, I was already out of bed and pacing the kitchen with a mug of coffee that had gone cold in my hands. The sleepless night had left me edgy, but strangely clear. I needed answers, and the only way to get them was to call my father. He picked up on the 4th ring, his voice gravelly like I had woken him, though I knew he was always up before 7. Claire, what is it? I didn't bother softening my words. Dad, Rachel uninvited me from her wedding. Did you know? There was a pause, the kind that said more than words. Then he cleared his throat. Your mother told me she was making changes. It sounded like it was already decided. I gripped the edge of the counter. And you didn't think to say anything? He sighed, weary. Honey, weddings are complicated. Your mom and Rachel, they want things a certain way. It didn't seem like my place to interfere. Your place is to be my father, I snapped, surprising even myself with the sharpness in my tone. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? He didn't answer right away. And when he did, his voice was soft, almost apologetic. I just don't want to make it worse. That was always his answer. Don't make it worse. Don't upset your mother. Don't stir the waters. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the same frustration that had followed me since childhood. You've spent your whole life not making it worse, Dad. And somehow it's always me who ends up paying the price. I ended the call before he could reply, setting the phone face down on the counter. My hands shook as I lifted the coffee to my lips, the bitterness biting harder than usual. Michael walked in from the bedroom, hair still damp from the shower, buttoning his shirt. You called him, didn't you? I nodded. He knew. He just didn't say anything. Michael crossed the room and wrapped his arms around me. I let my forehead rest against his chest, his steady heartbeat grounding me. He murmured into my hair. You can't keep expecting them to stand up for you. You're the only one who can do that now. The words cut, but they were true. Later that afternoon, I sat in my car outside the grocery store, unable to make myself go in. The phone sat in the cup holder, Rachel's name, staring at me in the text thread above her last message. Every part of me wanted to call her, to demand an explanation, to shout until my voice broke. But another part of me knew it would be useless. She would spin it, make it sound reasonable, and I would leave the call doubting myself. Instead, I scrolled to Melissa's contact and hit call. She answered on the first ring. Tell me you're not sitting at home stewing. Close. I'm sitting in my car stewing. Her laugh was short, sharp. Okay, spill. I told her about my father, about how he admitted knowing but didn't think it was his place to intervene. Melissa groaned. That's classic, always the peacekeeper even if it means sacrificing you. Exactly. I rubbed my temples. I feel like I'm screaming into a void. She was quiet for a beat, then said firmly, "You're not crazy, Claire. You're not overreacting. You've been carrying this family for years and they've gotten comfortable letting you do it." I swallowed hard, the truth of her words sitting heavy. Melissa continued, "And you know what makes me the angriest? It's that you still think you owe them something." Her voice was like a hand pulling me back from the edge. I sat there in the parked car, blinking against the sting in my eyes. I wanted to argue, to explain that family was supposed to be worth the sacrifice, but I couldn't find the words. After we hung up, I sat in silence, the hum of traffic around me. My phone buzzed again with a notification. Against my better judgment, I opened Instagram. There she was, Rachel in a flowing sundress, standing on a pier with her fiancé Trevor. The caption read, "Maldives countdown begins. 150 guests confirmed." My stomach lurched. 150. Not a tight list, not budget cuts, not anything resembling the excuse my mother had tried to feed me. It was abundance. Everyone she could possibly want except me. I stared at the photo until the screen blurred. People were flooding the comments with heart emojis and congratulations, gushing over how perfect she looked, how magical the wedding would be. Not one person there knew that she had erased her own sister like I was, nothing more than a distant acquaintance. When Michael came home from work that evening, he found me on the couch with the lights still off, the photo still glowing on my phone. He sat beside me, glanced at the screen, and then at my face. "She really posted the guest count," I nodded. 150. He reached over, took the phone from my hand, and set it on the table. Then he cupped my chin, making me look at him. "You can keep letting this destroy you, or you can decide what you're going to do about it." I held his gaze, my chest tightening. For the first time, I realized I didn't have to stay silent. There were things I knew, things Rachel would never want anyone else to hear. Secrets I had kept for her debts. I had paid lies I had smoothed over. She thought she had cut me out clean, but she forgot that I held the pieces of her story that could tear it all down. The thought scared me and thrilled me all at once. Michael must have seen it in my eyes because his voice softened. "Whatever you decide, I'll stand with you." I leaned back, closing my eyes as the weight of years pressed down and something new stirred beneath it. This time, I wasn't just going to swallow it. Not anymore. The next morning, I sat at the dining table with a legal pad open in front of me, scribbling half-thoughts that never seemed to form into anything solid. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Michael had already left for the office, and I had no distractions left to hide behind. My mind kept circling back to a memory I had pushed down for nearly 2 years, the winter when my grandmother Eleanor died. It had been January of 2021, cold and gray in Eugene, Oregon, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones. I had flown down for the funeral and stayed an extra week to help sort through her things. Grandma had always been the anchor of our family, steady, practical, never one for fuss. A month before she passed, she had told me in her quiet, matter-of-fact way that she was leaving the house to me. Not because it was fancy, she said with a small smile, but because she wanted me to have one thing that was mine, no strings attached. At the time, I had nodded, not sure what to say, but I carried that promise like a secret talisman. Until the day after the funeral, when my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen. She said there was a new will, one I had never seen, that split everything equally between the family. Her tone left no room for questions, so I let it drop, exhausted and too raw with grief to argue. Now, sitting in my apartment years later, the memory burned fresh. Something about it had never felt right, and with Rachel's wedding playing out the way it was, I couldn't shake the sense that this missing piece mattered more than I realized. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to David Lee's number. He was a friend of Michael's from grad school, now a probate attorney in Portland. I had met him a few times at barbecues, quiet and sharp, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. My fingers hovered over the screen before I pressed call. He answered on the second ring, professional but warm. Claire, how are you? I cut straight to it. David, I need to ask you something about my grandmother's estate. She passed in 2021. My mother told me there was a new will, but I never saw it. Do you think you could check what's on file? There was a pause. He didn't sound surprised, just thoughtful. Sure, give me her full name and the county where the probate was filed. I rattled off the details, my voice steadier than I felt. He promised to look into it and call me back. The rest of the day stretched long. I tried to distract myself with errands, but every time my phone buzzed, I felt my stomach clench. It wasn't until nearly 8 that evening that David finally called. I stepped out onto the balcony, the Seattle rain misting lightly in the air. My hand trembled as I answered. David, did you find anything? He didn't make me wait. The most recent will on file is from 2019. It names you as the sole beneficiary of the Eugene property. For a moment I thought I had misheard. Just me, yes, he said firmly, and there's no record of any later document. If your mother claims there was another will, it was never filed legally, which means it has no effect. I leaned against the railing, the city lights swimming below me. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind, steady and certain. One thing that is yours, no strings attached. So what does that mean? I asked. It means the house is yours, Claire. It always has been. I hung up and stood in the damp air, my heart thudding hard. For 2 years my mother had let me believe something that wasn't true. She had taken the one gift my grandmother meant for me and folded it into her version of fairness where Rachel always came first. When Michael came home later, I was still standing by the balcony door, the papers from my legal pad scattered across the table. He set his bag down and frowned. What happened? I told him everything, every detail, my voice breaking in places as I admitted how easily I had believed my mother. He listened without interrupting, then walked over and pulled me into his arms. She lied to you, he said softly, but not with surprise. You've let her rewrite your story too many times. I pressed my face against his chest, hot tears finally spilling over. I wasn't crying just for the house. I was crying for all the years I had let them decide what I deserved. Michael pulled back, his eyes searching. Mine. What are you going to do? I wiped at my face, steadier now. I'm not sure yet. But I know this. I'm done being quiet. The words settled in the room like a promise. I gathered the papers back into a pile, slid the phone into my pocket, and looked out at the rain-slick streets below. For the first time in a long while, I felt like the ground beneath me was solid. Inside, Michael turned off the lights and locked the door, leaving the two of us in the soft glow of the city. I lay awake that night, not restless this time, but alive, knowing that something bigger had shifted. It wasn't just about Rachel's wedding anymore. It was about the truth that had been stolen from me and the decision to finally claim it. The morning after David's call, I woke before the alarm, the sky outside still dark and heavy with rain. I moved quietly through the apartment, made coffee, and sat at the dining table with my notebook open in front of me. The pages were filled with lists, arrows, underlined words that I had scrawled in the hours after the call. Plans, fragments, pieces of something I was only beginning to shape. Michael shuffled out of the bedroom, his hair sticking up his tie in his hand. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter watching me. You didn't sleep, did you? Not much. He came over and sat down across from me. So what's next? I tapped the notebook. I don't know all the steps yet, but I know I can't let them keep rewriting everything. If Grandma wanted me to have that house, then I have to claim it. Michael studied me for a long moment, then reached for my hand. You've carried their silence long enough. If you want to do this, I'll be right beside you. I felt my throat tighten. He always said that, and he always meant it. The day stretched on, each hour a blur of errands I barely remembered doing. By evening, I found myself on the couch with a folder in my lap, the scanned copy of the will, printed and tucked inside. I stared at the words Eleanor Bennett, leaving her property at 317 Ashwood Lane in Eugene, to her granddaughter Claire Bennett. The black ink felt like an anchor proof that I had not imagined her promise. That night, while Michael graded project reports on his laptop, I sat with my pen and wrote a letter. Not to send, just to see the words on paper. I wrote to Rachel, to Mom, to Dad. I told them I knew the truth now. That I was done being the one they erased. That if they wanted their spotless wedding in the Maldives, they should remember that secrets don't stay buried forever. The next morning, I folded the letter and slid it into the folder with the will. My hands didn't shake this time. When I got to work, I sat in the glass-walled conference room with my team listening as they pitched ideas for a new campaign. Normally, I would be fully present, but today my mind kept drifting. I caught myself staring at the city skyline, wondering how many years I had given to everyone else's plans, how many nights I had stayed late to cover for Rachel's emergencies while my own life waited. After the meeting, I called Melissa. She answered, while walking to her car, the wind rushing through her phone speaker. "Well, you sound serious. What's going on?" I told her about David, about the will, about the truth that had been hidden for 2 years. She cursed under her breath. "Claire, that's not just selfish. That's theft. I know. So what are you going to do?" I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, staring at the rain streaking down the office window. "I'm going to stop protecting her." Melissa was quiet for a beat. Then her voice softened. "It's about time!" That evening, Michael and I ate takeout at the kitchen counter. He talked about a project at work, but I could tell he was watching me out of the corner of his eye. Finally, he set down his chopsticks and asked, "Are you ready for what comes with this?" I hesitated. Ready, number? But willing? Yes. He reached across the counter and squeezed my hand. Then that's enough. Later, lying in bed, I thought about the Maldives. About Rachel walking down an aisle set against turquoise water, about the photographers capturing every moment she curated for the world. And I thought about what it would look like if the truth cut through all of it like lightning. I didn't smile at the thought. I just breathed slow and steady and let the image settle. By Friday, I had packed a small bag. Not a full suitcase, just enough to feel like a beginning. Michael watched as I zipped it shut. "Where are you going?" he asked, gently. I looked at him, my heart thudding with both fear and resolve. To face them. He nodded once, no argument, no persuasion, just trust. I tucked the folder into the side pocket of the bag, ran my fingers over the edge of the paper, and closed the zipper. My decision had been made. For the first time in years, I wasn't moving out of obligation. I was moving with purpose. The airport was crowded with families hauling beach bags and honeymooners clutching boarding passes like golden tickets. I walked beside Michael with my carry-on trailing behind me, the folder tucked deep in my bag, its weight heavier than anything I packed. He slipped his arm through mine as we moved toward security, his steady presence grounding me in the chaos. On the plane, I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, Rachel's message flashed like neon against the dark. "This is my moment only." I shifted in my seat, restless, until Michael handed me his headphones and pointed to the movie playing on his screen. I smiled faintly, slid them on, and let the sound wash over me. He always knew when distraction was the only thing I needed. When we landed in Malé, the air was thick with heat and salt. A driver from the resort held a sign with Rachel's new last name already printed on it, though the marriage had not yet happened. I caught sight of it as we passed through the terminal, my chest tightening. Michael leaned close and whispered, "Ignore it. That sign isn't for you." The seaplane ride to the island was surreal. Water stretched endlessly in every direction, turquoise bleeding into deeper blue. The villas rose out of the ocean, on stilts, each one more extravagant than the last. When we stepped onto the dock, our resort attendants in coral uniforms greeted us with cold towels and hibiscus drinks. Our villa was its own sanctuary. Glass walls opened onto a private deck where the water lapped just below. I slipped off my sandals and walked barefoot across the warm planks, staring at the horizon. For a moment I let myself breathe, but the quiet only reminded me why I was here. That evening, Michael and I walked down the main beach where the wedding resort shimmered in the distance. I could see lanterns strung along the boardwalk, floral arches set against the sea staff, moving briskly to prepare. Rachel's world was being staged like a movie set, every detail curated for cameras and guests. From the shadows I watched as she posed with Trevor in front of a photographer, She wore a white jumpsuit that hugged her figure, her hair swept back in waves. She laughed brightly, tossing her head like someone who had never doubted her place in the world. For a moment, the sound transported me back to childhood, to birthday parties, where she blew out my candles, or school plays, where she insisted on the biggest costume. Always center stage, always louder than life. Michael's hand brushed mine. "You don't have to torture yourself watching this." I couldn't look away. She smiled for the camera, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the room, making sure every angle was perfect. It wasn't joy, it was control. The next morning, I sat on our deck, sipping coffee, the folder open on my lap. The paper felt both fragile and powerful. I traced my grandmother's signature with my finger, hearing her voice in my memory. "This house is yours, Claire. No strings attached." Michael came out with his mug, barefoot and relaxed. His hair was tousled, his smile soft. "How are you holding up?" I closed the folder and slid it back into my bag. "Stronger than I thought I'd be." He kissed the top of my head. "That's my girl." Later, we wandered into the village on the other side of the island. Local children ran barefoot through narrow streets, vendors sold coconuts from wooden stands, and the smell of grilled fish drifted through the humid air. It was a world away from the manicured perfection of the wedding resort. I found myself relaxing, for the first time my shoulders easing, as I laughed with Michael over a carved turtle figurine he insisted looked like me. But when we returned to the resort, reality snapped back. Rachel had posted new photos on social media. Her caption read, "Family arriving, can't wait to celebrate with everyone." 150 hearts, 50 comments, a parade of adoration. Not one word about the sister who had carried her through every storm. I set my phone down hard on the nightstand. Michael glanced over, reading my expression. "What now?" I breathed in, deep, steadying myself. "Tomorrow is the rehearsal dinner. That's when it happens." He studied me carefully. "You're sure?" "Yes. She thinks she's untouchable here, surrounded by cameras and praise. But the truth doesn't care about her spotlight." Michael nodded once, his eyes unwavering. "Then we'll be ready." That night, I lay awake listening to the ocean slap against the stilts beneath our villa. The sound was steady, unrelenting, like a reminder. I thought about Rachel's laughter, about my father's silence, about my mother's sighs that always made me the problem. I thought about Melissa's voice telling me peace would only come when I stopped begging for a place at their table. As dawn broke, the water outside turned silver. I rose quietly, wrapped myself in a linen robe, and stepped onto the deck. The air was cool, the horizon just beginning to glow. For the first time in years, I felt a calm that came not from being needed, but from being ready. Behind me, Michael stirred, his voice low and rough from sleep. "Big day today." I turned, met his gaze, and nodded. "Yes, big day." The dining hall glowed with soft lantern light, the kind that made everything look warmer than it felt. Long tables stretched across the polished wood floor, covered in white linen, and crowded with silverware that no one really knew how to use. I stood just inside the entrance, the cool air from outside still clinging to my skin. For a moment, no one noticed me. Then Rachel's eyes lifted from across the room, and the chatter dulled like someone had turned the volume down. She was in pale silk, her hair pulled into a loose bun that probably took 2 hours to style. Her smile faltered the second she saw me. She leaned toward Trevor, whispering something sharp, then stood and walked quickly across the room. Her voice was low but seething when she reached me. "What are you doing here?" I lifted my chin steady, even though my chest thudded hard. "I came for the dinner." Her laugh was brittle, the kind that covered fear. "You were not invited." Guests turned in their seats, watching like they had paid for tickets. The string quartet in the corner stopped mid-song. My mother's heels clicked against the floor as she approached, her face-tight eyes darting at the crowd. "Claire, this is not the time or place." I kept my voice calm, careful. "I am her sister. If it is the time for anyone to speak, it is me." Rachel's eyes flashed. "This is my night, mine. You don't get to make it about you." Before I could answer, a voice rose from the far side of the room. "Let her stay." Heads turned toward Aunt Maggie, who stood with her hands braced on the table. She wore a navy dress that didn't try to compete with the glitter around her, but her presence was louder than all of it. Claire has every right to be here. She is family. The room buzzed whispers, rushing through the crowd. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, staring at his folded napkin, pretending he was invisible. Rachel hissed through clenched teeth, "You don't belong here, Claire. Leave before you embarrass yourself." Something in me clicked the same sound as a lock turning. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, the paper inside, stiff and undeniable. I laid it on the nearest table, the pages catching the light. "If you want to talk about belonging, then let's talk about the truth." Rachel's face paled, her hand twitching like she wanted to snatch the folder away. The room grew still, the clinking of glasses fading. Trevor stood slowly, confusion flickering across his face. "What is that?" he asked. I held his gaze. "Proof. Proof that my grandmother left her house in Eugene to me, and only me. Proof that my mother and Rachel lied, said there was another will, and used that house to pay for this spectacle." The silence cracked into gasps. Someone dropped a fork, metal clattering against the floor. Trevor turned sharply to Rachel. "Is that true?" She shook her head, her voice high and frantic. "No, she is twisting it. She is jealous, she wants to ruin everything." I slid the document from the folder and handed it across the table to Maggie, who adjusted her glasses and read the words aloud. Clear, deliberate, my grandmother's handwriting carried across the hall like she had returned to the room. For Claire Bennett, always. Trevor's face drained of color. He looked at Rachel again, his voice tight. "Did you use that house for this wedding, Rachel?" Stammered, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The audience of family and friends watched with sharp eyes, the glamour peeling back one layer at a time. My mother stepped forward, her voice sharp and desperate. "Enough of this." Claire put it away. "This is not the time." I met her gaze squarely. "The time is when the truth has been buried. And that time is now." Rachel's composure shattered. She lunged toward me, fingers grabbing for the paper, but Trevor caught her wrist midair. His voice was low, dangerous. "Did you lie to me?" The room pulsed with silence. My father finally looked up, his mouth opening, but no words came. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Rachel wrenched her hand free, her eyes wet, her makeup smudging. "It doesn't matter. It was just a house." Trevor's jaw clenched. "It matters if you lied." I stepped back, letting the weight of their exchange carry through the room. The truth was no longer mine to hold or hide. It belonged to everyone who had chosen to look away, and now it was staring them down. For the first time in years, I felt my spine straighten. I was not the extra at the edge of the picture anymore. I was exactly where I needed to be. Trevor released Rachel's wrist, his expression unreadable. He looked at me, then back at her. "We will talk about this later." His voice was clipped, final, a blade slicing through the air. He walked out, leaving Rachel standing in the wreckage of her own night, the room watching, no one rushing to cover for her this time. I gathered the folder and slipped it back into my bag. My hands were steady, my heart a drum in my chest. Aunt Maggie caught my eye across the room, and for the first time, I saw approval in her gaze, not pity. The dinner resumed in uneasy murmurs, but nothing tasted the same. The stage had cracked, and everyone knew it. I sat down at an empty chair near the edge of the table, the lantern light flickering above me. For once, I was not invisible. When I woke the next morning, the air in the villa felt heavy, as if the storm from last night had seeped into the walls. Michael was already out on the deck, leaning on the railing with a cup of coffee, his back stiff. He didn't have to say anything. I knew the whole island had heard by now. I joined him, the floor cool under my bare feet. For a long moment, we just stood there, the water stretching endless in every direction, the silence between us filled with what came next. Finally, Michael said, "They know now. It can't be undone." I nodded. It felt strange, like breathing after being held underwater too long. I should have felt lighter, but instead a new weight pressed down, heavier than before. Later that morning, I walked along the boardwalk that led to the main resort. Conversations stopped when I passed. Some people tried to smile politely, others looked away quickly, embarrassed. The news had spread faster than the tide. At the far end of the terrace, I saw Rachel sitting alone with sunglasses hiding half her face. She was staring out at the ocean, her phone untouched on the table, her shoulders hunched, like she was bracing against a wind no one else could feel. I thought for a moment about walking over, about saying something, but the memory of her voice cut through my hesitation. "You don't belong here. Leave before you embarrass yourself." I kept walking. By noon, the whispers had reached Trevor. He found me near the lobby, his tie loosened, his eyes sharp but unsettled. "Can I talk to you?" We stepped into a shaded corner by the palm trees. He looked older than 31, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper than they had been yesterday. "Did she use the house?" he asked, his voice low as if the truth could still be contained if he whispered. "Yes," I said. "I didn't soften it. She and my mother sold it quietly. The money went into this wedding." He leaned against the wooden post, exhaling long and hard. I knew she was reckless, but I didn't think she would hide something like that. I wanted to tell him I wasn't surprised, but the grief in his eyes stopped me. He was a man who had planned his life around a future that was now cracking apart. When he finally looked at me again, his voice was hoarse. "Thank you for telling me." I nodded, unsure what comfort meant anymore. That afternoon, the atmosphere at the resort shifted. Guests whispered openly now, their curiosity no longer veiled. Some avoided Rachel, others approached her with cautious sympathy. She brushed them off with brittle smiles that collapsed as soon as they turned away. At dinner, fewer people gathered. Plates were pushed around more than eaten. My mother sat stiffly at the center of the table, her jaw clenched, speaking to no one. My father's eyes stayed fixed on the tablecloth, as if he could disappear if he stared long enough. Halfway through the meal, Trevor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The room fell silent. He looked straight at Rachel, his voice even but cold. "Tomorrow is cancelled." Gasps echoed through the hall. Rachel's fork clattered onto her plate. She shook her head violently. "No, you can't do this. We have photographers, vendors, everything booked." Trevor didn't flinch. "I won't marry someone who lies to me and to her own family." My mother tried to intervene, her hand gripping his arm. "Trevor, wait, we can fix this." He pulled his arm back, his eyes steady. "It's not your place to fix." Then he walked out, leaving silence heavy enough to crush the air from the room. Rachel stood frozen, her face pale beneath layers of makeup. For the first time, she didn't have words. I sat still, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways, but seeing it unfold felt surreal, like I was watching from outside my own body. Guests began to murmur, shifting uncomfortably. A few excused themselves quickly, eager to escape the tension. My mother's hands shook as she gripped her wineglass. My father stayed silent, his shoulders sagging like a man who had finally run out of excuses. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. No one tried to stop me. Outside, the night air was thick and warm, the ocean dark under the moonlight. Michael was waiting near the path, his expression unreadable. I walked straight into his arms, letting the silence hold me. For the first time in years, I felt the sharp edge of truth cut through every lie, leaving nothing but raw air behind. We stood there until the sounds of the dinner faded, until all that remained was the steady rhythm of waves against the shore. By sunrise, the resort no longer felt like a celebration. Staff moved quietly through the halls, avoiding eye contact, carrying away crates of flowers that would never be arranged. The smell of wilting roses drifted into the corridors, heavy and sour. I walked along the deck outside our villa, the boards damp beneath my feet, and listened to the murmurs traveling across the water. The story had already spread. When I stepped into the main lobby later that morning, I could feel the change. Guests huddled in small groups, their voices low, their glances sharp. A woman in a bright sundress whispered something to her husband as I passed. He shook his head, his expression tight, and the two of them walked quickly toward the dock. By noon, I watched at least a dozen guests check out their luggage stacked in neat rows while staff loaded boats. At the far end of the lobby, Rachel stood with her arms crossed, her sunglasses perched on top of her head, though we were indoors. She was arguing with Trevor's best man, her voice clipped and rising. "You don't understand," she said. "We just need time." He shook his head firmly and walked away, leaving her standing alone. My mother appeared a moment later, gripping Rachel's shoulders, as if she could hold her upright. I could only catch fragments of their conversation, but the desperation in my mother's tone was unmistakable. "You have to fix this, Rachel. Do something." Rachel's voice broke. "He walked out, Mom." "What do you want me to do? Drag him back?" I turned away before she could see me watching. I didn't need her glare or her venom. I had already felt enough of it to last a lifetime. Later that afternoon, I found myself on the terrace overlooking the water. Michael brought me a glass of iced tea and set it on the table beside me. He didn't sit right away, just stood behind me with his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. "You did what needed to be done," he said quietly. I shook my head. "It doesn't feel like victory." "It isn't about victory, Claire. It's about truth." I closed my eyes, letting his words sink in. The truth was ugly, and it was mine, and for the first time I had not buried it. As the day wore on, the tension deepened. The florists packed up their tools, the musicians left with their instruments. The arch on the beach, draped in orchids, leaned awkwardly in the wind until a staff member pulled it down. The fantasy dissolved piece by piece, and with every broken decoration, the reality sharpened. That evening, I sat outside our villa again, the sun sinking low, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and pink. Michael poured 2 glasses of wine, and we clinked them together without words. Across the water, I could see the main resort glowing faintly, but it no longer looked magical. It looked like a stage after the curtain had fallen. We were quiet until the sound of footsteps approached. I turned to see Aunt Maggie walking toward us, her dress wrinkled, her sandals dusty. She gave me a tired smile and lowered herself into the chair beside me. "You shook the ground last night," she said, her voice calm but steady. I searched her face for judgment, but found only a kind of weary pride. "I didn't want to destroy her," I whispered. "I just couldn't let the lie stand." Maggie nodded. "Lies always rot from the inside out. Better to cut them open while there's still time." Her words wrapped around me like a blanket. For years I had thought I was the only one who saw the rot. To know someone else had always noticed lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. As the 3 of us sat there, the sky deepened into purple, and the first stars appeared. For the first time since we landed in the Maldives, I felt something close to peace. The chaos swirled on the other side of the island, but here in the quiet I could breathe. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating against the nightstand. I reached for it reluctantly and saw the screen lit up with notifications. 39 missed calls, mostly from my mother, a few from my father, even one from Rachel. The sight of them made my stomach twist. I set the phone face down and climbed out of bed. Michael stirred and asked softly, "Are you going to answer, number?" "Not now, maybe not ever." I stepped out onto the deck, the breeze cool against my skin, and watched the tide pulling out. The ocean didn't care about weddings or secrets or broken promises. It just moved steady and endless. And for the first time, I thought maybe I could too. When I finally walked back into the main resort that morning, the atmosphere felt brittle, like glass stretched too thin. My mother sat stiffly at a corner table in the cafe, her sunglasses hiding half her face, though we were inside. She looked up when she saw me, motioned for me to join her. I almost turned around, but something in her expression stopped me. She leaned forward as soon as I sat down. "You've humiliated us, Claire. Do you even realize what you've done?" Her words landed like stones, but I kept my voice even. I told the truth. She shook her head sharply, lips pressed tight. "You destroyed your sister's future. Do you think Trevor will ever forgive her?" I stared at her, stunned by the twist. Rachel lies, Rachel steals, and somehow I am the villain for uncovering it. My chest ached, but I forced myself to breathe steady. I didn't destroy anything. She did that herself. My father shuffled over, then shoulders, slumped eyes cast down. He sat beside Mom without looking at me. His silence was worse than her accusations. Rachel arrived moments later. Her hair was undone, her face bare, her eyes red and swollen. She looked smaller, fragile, like a child caught in a lie she no longer knew how to cover. When she saw me, the exhaustion cracked into fury. "You couldn't let me have one thing, could you? Just one." I held her gaze. "I gave you everything. Every time you stumbled, I picked you up, and you erased me like I was nothing." Her lips trembled, but she didn't deny it. She turned to Mom, who reached for her hand, whispering comfort. The picture of them together, unified against me, was so familiar it hurt. Michael appeared behind me, then his hand resting gently on my shoulder. He didn't speak, but the steady weight of his touch reminded me I wasn't alone this time. The tension at the table grew unbearable. My father finally cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Maybe it's time we stopped pretending." His words hung in the air like smoke. Rachel pulled her hand from Mom's and stared at him, eyes wide, but he didn't continue. He just folded his napkin into smaller and smaller squares until it was nothing but a crumpled ball in his fist. I stood then, unable to sit in that suffocating silence any longer. Michael followed me out, his hand brushing mine as we walked. Outside, the resort grounds looked deserted. Staff moved quietly, avoiding eye contact. The once grand arch on the beach had been dismantled, the flowers piled in a heap near the dock. A group of guests wheeled their luggage toward the boats, their faces tight with discomfort. By evening, news of the cancelled wedding had spread across the island. I overheard two women at the bar whispering about it, their voices hushed but urgent. One of them glanced at me and quickly looked away. Back in our villa, I dropped onto the couch and buried my face in my hands. Michael sat beside me, waiting, patient as always. Finally, I whispered, "They will never see me as anything but the villain," he answered without hesitation. "Maybe, but that doesn't make it true." The words didn't fix the ache, but they steadied me. That night, as I lay in bed, the phone lit up again. 39 missed calls had become 47. My mother, my father, Rachel, even an unknown number that I suspected was Trevor. I turned the phone over so the screen faced down. I didn't need their voices in my head anymore. Sleep came late, heavy and restless. When I woke before dawn, the villa was quiet, Michael still breathing softly beside me. I stepped outside, the boards cool beneath my feet, the air heavy with salt. The horizon was just beginning to lighten. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared at the ocean, the waves steady and endless. For years I had measured my worth by how much I could fix, how much I could give, how much I could erase of myself to make room for them. Now all that was gone, stripped bare, and I was left standing in the silence of what remained. Behind me, Michael stirred, his voice rough from sleep. "You okay?" I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice. The tide kept moving, pulling out, returning, never asking permission. I stayed there watching, until the first sun broke the surface, the world washed in gold. It felt like both an ending, and something I didn't yet have words for. I spent most of that morning moving from room to room in the villa, restless, my mind circling the same thoughts. The quiet of the Maldives had always felt like a balm, but now it pressed down on me with a heaviness I couldn't shake. Michael suggested we take a walk along the shoreline, and I agreed, hoping the rhythm of the waves would settle me. We walked barefoot in the sand, the tide pulling gently at our ankles, the air warm and damp. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "You know you can't just leave it here, right?" I looked at him confused. "What do you mean?" He stopped and faced me, brushing damp hair from my cheek. "Rachel's secret, your grandmother's will, all of it. You uncovered the truth, but now you have to decide what you're going to do with it." His words hit a place I had been avoiding. For years, my role had been reactive, fixing what broke, smoothing what cracked. This was different. This was me choosing a path forward. Later that afternoon, I called Ethan. His voice was steady, professional, but warmer than I expected. I walked him through everything from Rachel's debts I had quietly covered to the night I found out about Grandma Jean's will. He listened carefully, asked precise questions, and then said, "Claire, if you want to pursue this legally, you have more than enough grounds. Your mother's concealment of the will could amount to fraud." Fraud. The word sat between us, heavy and undeniable. After the call, I sat on the balcony staring at the water until my coffee went cold. Michael joined me, placing his hand over mine. What did he say? That I can take it back? Not just the house. My place in the story. Michael smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time you did. The next day, while Rachel and my parents were still trying to patch together their shattered reputation at the resort, I started making notes. Dates, amounts of money, screenshots of texts where Rachel had begged me for help and promised to pay me back. I wrote down conversations with Mom about the will, even the exact phrasing she used when she told me Grandma had changed her mind. By evening, I had a small stack of documents tucked into a folder Ethan had sent me to print. That night, Michael and I ate dinner in near silence, the air thick with what lay ahead. I wanted to savor the island one last time before leaving, but I couldn't stop thinking of Eugene, of that little house my grandmother had promised me, of the lavender bushes she planted in the front yard. I fell asleep with the sound of the waves in my ears, knowing the real storm was waiting back home. When we landed in Portland 2 days later, the gray sky and damp air felt almost jarring after the sunlit Maldives. My phone buzzed constantly as we drove south to Eugene. Missed calls, voicemails, texts from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored them all. Pulling into the driveway of my grandmother's house was like stepping into a memory. The gate still squeaked, the porch light still tilted slightly to the left, the air smelled faintly of cedar. For a moment I stood frozen, suitcase in hand, until Michael touched my shoulder gently. "Go on," he whispered. Inside the house was unchanged. The worn rug in the hallway, the chipped blue paint on the kitchen cabinets, even the faint outline on the wall where her clock used to hang. It was as if she had just stepped out and would be back any minute. I walked slowly from room to room, running my hand along the door frames, pausing at the desk where she had kept her papers. I opened the top drawer, and there it was, the green plastic folder, labeled in her careful handwriting. My chest tightened. The will Ethan had confirmed, still valid, still binding, still mine. I sat at the desk and closed my eyes. For so long I had been erased, pushed to the margins of my own family story. Now here I was, sitting in the one place where I had always been seen. Michael found me there, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. He didn't speak. He simply wrapped his arms around me, anchoring me to the moment. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I stepped outside onto the porch and dialed Ethan again. I told him I was ready. Ready to claim the house, ready to file whatever paperwork was needed, ready to face whatever fallout would come. He assured me he would handle the filings discreetly and that my grandmother's wishes would be honored. After the call, I sat on the porch steps watching the light fade. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Rachel. "Please, Claire, don't do this. I need that house." I stared at the words, my throat tight, then typed back 3 simple sentences. "It was never yours. It was always mine. Grandma wanted it that way." I hit send and placed the phone face down beside me. The evening air was cool, the first stars flickering overhead. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in someone else's shadow. I was standing exactly where I was meant to be. The morning after I sent that message to Rachel, the air in Eugene felt different. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the quilt my grandmother had left me folded neatly on the chair across from me. For the first time in years, I felt like the ground beneath me was solid. The house was mine not because I demanded it, but because it was always meant to be. By mid-afternoon, my parents pulled into the driveway. I saw them through the window, my mother stepping out in her pale coat, my father walking stiffly behind her. Michael squeezed my hand once before leaving me to face them. He knew I needed to stand alone this time. They didn't knock, just came straight in like they always had. My mother's eyes scanned the room and landed on the quilt, her lips pressed tight. "Claire," she started, her voice already heavy with guilt and reproach, "this isn't what your grandmother wanted." I stood holding the green folder in my hand. "It has her signature, her handwriting, and it's filed legally with the court. This was her wish." My father spoke next, his voice low. "You could ruin this family by pressing forward." Do you want that on your shoulders? I took a deep breath, the kind that steadies you when every nerve is on fire. I've carried this family on my shoulders for decades. I am done. My mother tried again, softer this time. Rachel is devastated. She has lost everything. I looked straight at her. She lost Trevor because of her lies. She lost the wedding because of her cruelty. And now she lost the right to this house because she tried to erase me. Those were her choices, not mine. For once my father had no response. He lowered his gaze and shifted uncomfortably, like the weight of silence was heavier than my words. My mother's eyes glistened, but I didn't move to comfort her. I had spent my life patching her tears. This time I let them fall. When they left, the house grew quiet again. Michael came back in carrying groceries, and we cooked dinner together in the small kitchen. As we ate, I felt something inside me settle. It wasn't triumph, not even revenge. It was peace. The weeks that followed were filled with small steps forward. Ethan filed the paperwork, and the house was legally transferred to me. Rachel tried calling countless times, then sent a letter I never opened. My parents kept their distance, at least for now. I planted fresh lavender by the porch in honor of Grandma Jean, and every time I watered it, I felt her near. One evening, Michael and I sat on the porch with glasses of wine, watching the sun dip behind the trees. He asked me if I ever regretted it, choosing distance from my family. I thought about it, then shook my head. I don't regret choosing myself. He smiled and reached for my hand. That's the Claire I fell in love with. The sound of the crickets filled the pause, and for the first time the future didn't feel like something I had to brace against. It felt like something I could walk into freely. If you've listened to my story this far, thank you. Maybe you've been in a place where family loyalty felt heavier than love, where being a good sister or daughter meant disappearing into the background. If so, I hope my story reminds you that you have the right to choose yourself too. I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been cut out or dismissed by someone who should have stood by you? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, please like and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Together we can keep sharing the kinds of stories that remind us we are not alone.